The map of Eastern Europe in 1939 still bore the frontiers fixed by the Treaty of Riga, 1921. Poland's eastern border ran along the Daugava-Dnieper-Zbruch line, separating the Second Polish Republic from the Soviet republics of Belarus and Ukraine. The memory of the 1919 to 1921 Polish-Soviet War shaped policy on both sides. In Warsaw, planners treated the USSR as a potential adversary even when immediate attention focused on Germany. In Moscow, the loss of territories, with significant Belarusian and Ukrainian populations, was recorded as a temporary outcome subject to revision if conditions allowed. Between these two states lay a belt of mixed communities: Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Jews, Lithuanians, whose loyalties and expectations varied widely and would become politically consequential once armies moved. By early 1939, Germany had dismantled the balance established at Versailles. The annexation of Austria, March 1938, and the partition of Czechoslovakia, March 1939, changed the strategic geometry around Poland. On 31st March 1939, the United Kingdom issued a guarantee of Polish independence, later formalized into a mutual assistance agreement. France reaffirmed its alliance obligations. Polish strategy depended on these commitments producing either an offensive in the west or sustained material support through sea routes in the Romanian corridor. The General Staff planned to mobilize roughly 1.2 to 1.3 million personnel. Due to political pressure to avoid provoking Germany and to the need to keep economy and harvest running, full mobilization was staggered through late August and early September. By the outbreak of war, fielded Polish forces numbered under the planned strength, with formations still concentrating along the Vistula, Narrow, and in the southeast. The Soviet Union entered 1939 with a sizable army and an industrial base in recovery from the 5-year plans. But the command structure had been disrupted by the 1937 to 1938 purges. Doctrinally, the Red Army preserved concepts of deep operations, yet training unevenness and cadre losses affected execution. In the Far East, heavy fighting with Japan at Khalkhin Gol, May to September 1939, fixed substantial Soviet forces and influenced Moscow's risk calculations. The prospect of a two-front confrontation, Japan in the east, Germany or Poland in the west, encouraged diplomatic options that would defer immediate conflict in Europe and secure strategic depth. During the summer of 1939, Britain and France explored an understanding with the USSR. Negotiations on collective security reached Moscow in August. But the parties diverged on transit rights for Soviet troops through Poland and Romania and on definitions of aggression. Warsaw rejected the entry of Soviet forces on its territory during peacetime or under conditional guarantees, citing the experience of 1920 and concerns over sovereignty. The failure of these talks opened space for an alternative arrangement. On 19 August 1939, Germany and the USSR concluded a trade agreement that signalled a wider political realignment. 4 days later, on August 23rd, the foreign ministers Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov signed a non-aggression pact. A secret protocol delineated spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. In the event of territorial and political rearrangements, the line separating German and Soviet interests in Poland would run roughly along the Narew, Vistula and San rivers. The Baltic states and Bessarabia were addressed in separate clauses. The text did not prescribe immediate military action, but established a framework within which both parties could act without fear of the other's intervention. Polish intelligence monitored Soviet force concentrations in the western military districts, but assessed that the USSR would remain neutral as long as its talks with Britain and France continued, or until the outcome of the German-Polish War became clear. The General Staff's plans prioritized defense against Germany. Army Pomorze and Army Poznan in the corridor, and Greater Poland, Army Lodz near the centre, Army Kraków in the south, with reserve formations under the commander-in-chief. Eastern groupings were limited mainly to Border Protection Corps and mobilizing units. The long-standing Romanian bridgehead concept envisaged a pivot to the southeast should the front on the Vistula become untenable, enabling continued resistance and reception of Allied supplies via Black Sea ports. This plan assumed Soviet neutrality, or at least the absence of a hostile move from the east. Moscow's assessment of the Polish state combined military and political elements. Soviet analysts highlighted the diversity of eastern voivodeships and reported on local grievances concerning land distribution, language policy, and administration. In the Red Army, the Belarusian and Kyiv special military districts rehearsed large unit movements through 1938 to 1939, nominally for defensive scenarios. After the pact with Germany, the Soviet leadership prepared contingency directives for protecting populations in western Belarus and western Ukraine should Polish state authority collapse. The NKVD compiled administrative frameworks for eventual security tasks behind advancing units. Public messaging remained restrained until war began in the West. On September 1, 1939, Germany attacked Poland along multiple axes. Air raids struck Warsaw, Lodz, Kraków, and communication hubs. Armoured spearheads sought to penetrate between Polish armies and reach crossing points on the Vistula, and Sani France and Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September, fulfilling alliance obligations but without immediate large-scale ground operations in the West. Polish forces fought delaying actions and attempted counterstrokes near the Bzura and in Silesia, while withdrawing toward more defensible lines. From 3 to 10 September, the government of Poland relocated from Warsaw to Lublin and then toward Kryzy, aligning with the Romanian bridgehead expectation. Throughout this period, Warsaw's diplomatic instructions to its embassy in Moscow emphasized the legal state of non-aggression under the 1932 Polish-Soviet Pact, renewed in 1934, and requested clarification of Soviet intentions. Inside the Kremlin, the German advance and the rapid erosion of Polish administrative control east of the Vistula were read as confirmation that the Polish state might lose the capacity to perform governance and defense functions. Berlin pressed for implementation of the secret protocol to avoid the emergence of a power vacuum or a potential third-party administration. Soviet industry completed late summer call-ups in western districts and pre-positioned fuel and ammunition to forward depots. Units earmarked for any eastern movement were predominantly equipped with T-26 and BT series tanks, and supported by I-16 and I-15 fighters and SB bombers. Polish formations on the eastern frontier relied on Korpus Ochrony Pogranicze, mobilizing infantry, and limited armoured cars and tankettes. Public sentiment across the region was mixed and contingent on locality. In central and western Poland, civilian morale under bombardment depended on the pace of evacuation and the continuity of rail traffic. In the eastern voivodeships, communities watched events via rumours, limited press, and returning reservists. Some anticipated continuity under Warsaw, others feared German occupation, and still others weighed how a Soviet entry would affect land tenure, schools, or religious institutions. Internationally, the League of Nations lacked tools for immediate crisis management, and the major powers focused on their own mobilizations. By mid-September, three conditions converged. German forces had taken substantial areas of western and central Poland. Polish authorities were reorienting toward the southeast, and the USSR had secured diplomatic cover through the August Agreement. In this environment, the question of whether and when a second belligerent would cross Poland's eastern border moved from hypothesis to operational planning, setting the stage for the decisions announced on September 17th. In the early hours of September 17, 1939, Soviet representatives handed a note in Moscow to the Polish ambassador Wacław Grzybowski, stating that the Polish state had lost the capacity to defend its citizens and that the USSR would assume protection over populations in western Belarus and western Ukraine. Within hours, formations of the Belarusian front and the Ukrainian front crossed the border along a line from the Dwina-Dnieper interfluve to the Carpathians. The move followed the pattern set by the August agreements with Germany, but was framed publicly as a security operation. On the Polish side, the commander-in-chief, Marshal Edward Ryd-Smigli, issued instructions that Soviet troops were not to be engaged unless they attempted to disarm Polish units. Priority was the preservation of forces and the movement of government institutions toward the Romanian and Hungarian frontiers. The Soviet order of battle for the opening phase grouped roughly 25 to 30 rifle divisions, several cavalry corps, and more than a dozen tank brigades under two fronts. The Belarusian front advanced toward Wilno, Grodno, Baranovice, and Brest. The Ukrainian front moved on Lvov, Tarnopol, Kovel, and Stanisławów. Available data for mid-September indicates several 100,000 personnel, figures ranging between approximately 450,000 and 600,000, supported by 26 and BT series tanks, BA-10 and BA-20 armoured cars, and air cover from I-16 and I-15 fighters with SB bombers. Polish forces in the east consisted primarily of border units of Korpus Ochrony Pogranicze, mobilizing infantry divisions still forming, and rear area services. On many sectors, the immediate ratio in personnel and armour exceeded 5-1 in favour of the Soviet side. In some approaches, the disparity in tanks reached triple digits, as Polish formations relied mainly on TK and TKS tankettes, and limited numbers of 7 TP tanks concentrated elsewhere. Command links shaped initial decisions. In Warsaw, the government and high command had relocated from the capital to Lublin and then to the southeast between 6 and 13 September. By night of September 17th to 18th, ministers and the president moved toward the Romanian frontier near Cuti to avoid capture by German forces closing from the west and to preserve international continuity. Field armies engaged with Germany, Pomorze, Poznan, Lodz, Krakow, Prusy, were already split or withdrawing. In the east, ad hoc groupings under regional commanders coordinated border defence, road control, and the transit of columns heading for the Romanian bridgehead. The Soviet fronts, by contrast, began with pre-arranged axes and explicit tasks to disarm Polish formations, occupy administrative centres, and secure rail nodes. The first day's movements reflected these asymmetries. Soviet spearheads advanced 30 to 70 kilometres where bridges and roads allowed. Columns passed through Volkovysk toward Grodno, from Polisi toward Pinsk and Kobrin, and along the Volhynian corridors toward Łódź and Kovel. Aviation reconnaissance targeted junctions and river crossings rather than Polish airfields, which in the eastern zone were few and largely evacuated. Polish local commands ordered the destruction of depots and the blocking of bridges, but the scale of German operations in the west had already redirected engineering assets and heavy equipment. In several counties, police and KOP battalions organised short delaying actions to hold roads open for civilian and military convoys moving south. At the operational level, both sides framed their actions in regulatory language. Soviet proclamations addressed to residents announced the restoration of order and the convening of new authorities. Field directives emphasized the collection of weapons, the control of communications, and the avoidance of unnecessary damage to infrastructure needed for onward movement. Polish orders stressed avoidance of entanglement. Units were to disengage from Soviet columns when possible, maintain cohesion, and continue marching toward pre-designated assembly zones near Straj, Kołomija, and Czerniowce corridors. Where Soviet forces attempted to disarm entire formations, Polish commanders weighed compliance against the risk of encirclement and the legal implications of surrender to a state with which Poland was not formally at war on the 16th of September. Civilian experience on September 17th to 19th varied by locality. In Wilno and surrounding towns with rail links, the arrival of Soviet armoured cars and infantry coincided with administrative changes. Police stations and offices were disarmed, and municipal committees were instructed to continue essential services. In Polisi, forest cover, marsh terrain, and limited roads slowed the advance and produced scattered contacts between Soviet reconnaissance groups and Polish border platoons or traffic control posts. In Volhynia and eastern Galicia, columns of refugees, retreating troops, and horse-drawn carts created congestion. Soviet units established checkpoints, disarmed soldiers, and directed civilians off main routes needed for military traffic. International channels registered the change but lacked immediate means to effect it. The British and French governments, already at war with Germany, noted the new front on September 17th through diplomatic reporting and press summaries. Neither state had pre-existing commitments that mandated operations against the USSR in response to an intervention on Polish territory. Germany's leadership monitored the advance and exchanged military liaison information to avoid incidents along converging axes, as armoured and motorised divisions from the west approached lines identified in late August for delimitation. By September 18th, several administrative centres, Wilno, Nowogródek and Pinsk, were under Soviet control. Grodno and Lwów remained contested, with local Polish commands organising resistance to retain crossing points and maintain lines of withdrawal. The evacuation of the Polish government into Romania on September 17th to 18th removed the immediate political authority that had coordinated the Romanian bridgehead concept. For field units, this created an additional layer of uncertainty over the status of orders and the prospects for continued organised resistance in the southeast. In this environment, contacts at roadblocks, bridges, and town perimeters multiplied. Some ended with negotiated disarmament and release of officers on parole. Others escalated into firefights when commanders perceived risks to their columns or when communications failed. The opening phase thus combined rapid territorial movement with fragmented engagements. The Soviet fronts achieved early objectives of crossing the border and taking key towns. Polish formations executed withdrawals under simultaneous pressure from two directions, with the objective of preserving personnel and reaching foreign territory. The balance of forces, the condition of command networks, and the evolving diplomatic context shaped choices on both sides and set up the confrontations that would follow around major urban nodes and river lines in the next days. Planning for the Eastern operation rested on a set of defined objectives and an assumption about the tempo of events. In Moscow, the political aim was to extend state control to territories east of the Narew-Vistula-San line and to prevent any foreign power from establishing a protectorate in those areas. The military aim was to disarm Polish formations east of the Bug and San before they could consolidate in the Romanian bridgehead. Supporting objectives included the seizure of rail junctions, river crossings, and administrative centres needed to manage population and supply. Command and security organs prepared to follow the advancing fronts to establish interim administration, register personnel, and secure key archives and treasuries. The planning horizon was measured in days, not weeks, with the expectation that most contacts would be resolved by negotiation or brief engagements, rather than large battles. The Belarusian front and the Ukrainian front organised their advances on parallel axes with complementary tasks. On paper, the fronts together fielded approximately 450,000 to 600,000 personnel on September 17th against an eastern Polish grouping of roughly 250,000 to 300,000 troops in transit or assembly, including border units, depot cadres, and fragments of field divisions moving from the interior. The Soviet force package combined rifle divisions for holding terrain, cavalry corps for rapid penetration on secondary roads, and more than a dozen tank brigades for road-bound thrusts toward Wilno, Grodno, Lwów, and Kowal. Comparative armour strength on the opening routes placed several hundred T-26 and BT tanks against Polish TK and TKS tankettes, numbering in the dozens per sector, with a limited pool of 7 TP tanks concentrated primarily in the west and centre earlier in the campaign. Air support planned reconnaissance of roads, bridges, and town perimeters rather than airfield suppression. Logistics assumptions reflected the constraints of gauge, distance, and road capacity. Because Polish lines were built to 1435mm and Soviet supply to 1524mm, rail echelons halted at forward depots inside the USSR, while pioneer units prepared transshipment and selective regauging of captured sections. In the first week, fuel and ammunition flow depended on motor columns, horse transport, and captured stocks in border towns. Planners prioritized routes Minsk-Baranowice-Brest and Gomel-Kowel for the northern and central sectors, and Szepetówka-Łódź for the south. Each front scheduled daily objectives in the 30 to 60 kilometre range, contingent on bridge availability and the capacity of motor pools to keep pace with tank brigades. Engineering directives emphasised bridge seizure intact, where possible to avoid delays caused by pontoon deployment on the Bug, Pripyat channels, and sand tributaries. The command architecture layered political, operational, and security functions. Front commanders issued rules of engagement stating that the primary task was disarmament and establishment of control, with avoidance of prolonged clashes that would slow the timetable. NKVD detachments moved close behind leading units to set up filtration points for officers, police, and state officials, and to secure prisons, post and telegraph offices, and banks. Political departments prepared proclamations in Polish, Belarusian, and Ukrainian, announcing the formation of temporary authorities and promising land redistribution and labour rights, subject to later legal acts. The plan included convening local assemblies after occupation to endorse administrative changes, with elections to follow on a schedule to be announced. On the Polish side, planning in September revolved around two timelines that now intersected. The first was the pre-war concept of the Romanian bridgehead. As long as major forces and the government could reach the southeast triangle bounded by Stryjkowo-Major-Czerniowce, the state could continue resistance and receive Allied supplies through Black Sea ports. The second was the accelerating German offensive in the west, which forced repeated reallocation of reserves and transport assets away from the eastern provinces. When the Soviet note arrived on September 17th, the Commander-in-Chief's instruction to avoid combat with Soviet units, unless disarmament was attempted, was consistent with the original bridgehead logic. Preserve personnel, avoid encirclement, and cross into Romania or Hungary if necessary. Regional commands were told to maintain order on roads, continue southward movement, and negotiate safe passage when possible. Operationally, Polish planners sought to trade space for time in the east while preserving cohesion. Columns were organised around the remnants of divisions and border battalions with attached police and administrative staffs. Ammunition and fuel were limited. Communications relied on field couriers and shortwave sets with intermittent reception. Comparative capacity on the road network favoured the Soviet plan. Tank brigades supported by motor rifle units could overtake marching columns, bypass towns, and reach crossings ahead of defenders. Where Polish engineers had prepared demolitions, rearward pressure from German advances or shortages of explosives and fuses sometimes precluded destruction of bridges, a detail that influenced the speed calculations on both sides. Information and messaging formed a distinct layer of planning. Soviet proclamations presented the entry as protection of local populations and restoration of order. Polish communiques to troops and civilians emphasized the legal continuity of the state, the absence of a declared war with the USSR before September 17th, and the standing alliances with Britain and France against Germany. Both sides monitored local responses. In some districts, village elders and municipal clerks remained at posts to maintain services. In others, the flight of county officials created gaps that military administrations had to fill. The management of mixed urban populations, Polish, Jewish, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, required explicit instructions to prevent disturbances that could affect movement on main roads. Coordination with Germany was built into the planning through liaison channels established after the August agreements. Maps with provisional delimitation lines were exchanged to reduce the risk of incidents as formations moved on convergent routes toward Brest, Białystok, and along the San. The practical goal was to avoid roadblocks between German armoured columns and Soviet tank brigades, and to define responsibility for garrisons until a formal boundary treaty could be negotiated. For Polish commanders, this presented an additional planning constraint. Any attempt to concentrate against one opponent risked exposure on the opposite flank, further reinforcing the default choice of continued withdrawal to the southeast. Risk assessments on both sides identified miscalculation points. For the Soviet fronts, the principal risks were bridge demolitions that could immobilize tank brigades, local resistance in large cities that might consume time and ammunition, and supply delays caused by road congestion. For Polish groupings, the main risks were encirclement near river bends and junction towns, loss of command continuity after the government crossed into Romania, and uncertainty about the treatment of soldiers and civilians who surrendered or were disarmed. Planners attempted to mitigate these risks with speed, negotiated passages, and narrowly defined tactical engagements. In sum, the strategic plan that took shape between 13 and 17 September aligned political objectives with operational design, rapid occupation to the agreed line, administrative substitution where state structures had ceased to function, and the disarmament of Polish forces before they could establish a new defensive zone in the southeast. Polish planning, constrained by earlier commitments and the Western Front, aimed to save manpower and preserve the legal existence of the state through relocation. The interaction of these plans defined the tempo and geography of the next phase, when urban nodes, river crossings, and rail junctions became the focal points of contact. The first contacts along the border on September 17th ranged from negotiated disarmament to brief firefights. In the Policy marshlands, small Kopi platoons at isolated posts were approached by Soviet patrols under white flags with orders to collect weapons and allow soldiers to return home. Some posts complied after registering personnel. Others withdrew south along forest tracks to avoid separation from marching columns. On the Volhynian roads, led elements of Soviet tank brigades reached crossings over the Horyn and Steyr before Polish engineers could complete demolitions, forcing ad hoc delaying actions by rear guards using machine guns and 37mm anti-tank guns to hold junctions long enough for supply wagons and civilian convoys to clear. Urban centres became focal points within 24 to 48 hours. Wilno, administratively overloaded by refugees from Western voivodeships, received Soviet armoured cars on the 18th to 19th of September. The municipal authorities attempted to maintain essential services, waterworks, bakeries, hospitals, while local Polish commanders assessed whether a defence could serve the larger aim of moving units southeast. After short negotiations and limited exchanges on approaches, Soviet units occupied key buildings and rail yards. Garrisons were disarmed, officers registered, and trains requisitioned for troop movements deeper into the interior. The priority given to rail nodes allowed the Belarusian front to extend supply lines rapidly toward Lida and Baranovice. Grodno presented a different pattern. On September 20th to 22nd, a mix of police, KOP detachments, and mobilized volunteers organized barricades at bridgeheads over the Niemen and at road entrances from the east. Soviet tank and motor rifle elements probed the defenses, seeking crossings to bypass the center. Fighting developed around street corners and rail embankments, with improvised obstacles forcing tanks to slow and infantry to clear houses. Polish defenders employed bottles with fuel, grenades, and a limited number of anti-tank guns to delay advances toward the river line. The immediate operational aims on each side shaped decisions. The Soviets sought to open the route west and secure bridges. The Polish command attempted to keep the bridgeheads long enough to cover withdrawals toward the south while avoiding a prolonged siege. After 2 days, Soviet units took control of crossings and administrative points. Polish survivors broke into smaller groups and moved through secondary roads to rejoin columns heading for the Romanian frontier. Farther south, Lwów, already encircled from the west by German forces since mid-September, became a joint point of pressure. Soviet spearheads reached the eastern suburbs on 19th to 20th September and established positions around key roads and railway approaches. The city's defenders, a composite of army units, police, and local formations, sustained artillery exchanges and localized counterattacks to keep corridors open to the southeast. Negotiations on September 21st to 22nd produced an agreement for the garrison's surrender to the Soviets rather than to the Germans, a decision influenced by assessments of treatment, prospects for preserving civilian administration, and the desire to avoid urban destruction. The transfer of control changed the local balance without altering the wider German-Soviet delimitations still under discussion at the political level. Brest on the Bug, taken earlier in the month by German forces after fighting with the Polish 9th and 20th Infantry Divisions, shifted to Soviet control on September 22nd as formations from the east reached the city. The passage involved coordination through liaison officers and set a template for handovers at other towns along the provisional line. For Polish units attempting to move south through the Bug crossings, these changes restricted options and forced detours toward lesser-known fords and pontoon sites, increasing delays and attrition among marching groups. In Volhynia, the approach routes to Łuk, Kołl and Włodzimierz-Wolyński witnessed a succession of roadside engagements. Polish columns, infantry with horse-drawn carts and fragments of artillery, encountered Soviet reconnaissance groups that tried to persuade commanders to lay down arms with assurances of release. Where commanders judged the situation as risking encirclement, short firefights occurred to clear the road. The disparity in speed and armour meant that even when Polish units repelled the first attempt, subsequent Soviet echelons could bypass and establish new checkpoints ahead. Civilians, moving alongside or within columns, experienced repeated searches and confiscations of firearms, with municipal committees asked to resume work under new oversight. East of the Bug in Polesie, Pinsk and Kobrin changed hands after brief resistance by local detachments. The riverine terrain offered opportunities for withdrawals by boat and barge, but the scarcity of craft and fuel limited their use. Soviet units concentrated on seizing bridges intact and securing telegraph offices, post and banks. Administration continued with minimal interruption in many towns. Bread distribution and power supply were maintained where possible to avoid unrest that could hamper movement on highways. The speed of administrative substitution contrasted with the fragmentation on Polish command channels as staffs moved toward the Romanian border and relied on couriers for orders. Isolated actions by cohesive Polish groupings continued as September progressed. The KOP formations assembled under General Wilhelm Orlik Reutemann executed fighting withdrawals and local counterattacks to break through blocking positions and maintain southward movement. At road junctions near Sak on 28 September, Polish border troops and remnants of regular units engaged Soviet forces in a coordinated attack that temporarily reopened the route before superior numbers and artillery prompted a further withdrawal. Similar contacts occurred at Koziałce, near the Lithuanian border, on September 21st, and at Wytyczno on October 1st, where tactical success in initial phases could not offset the operational imbalance in mobility and supply. Aviation played a supporting role. Soviet reconnaissance flights identified columns and bridges, directing ground units rather than conducting large-scale bombing in the eastern sector. Polish air assets in the area were limited to liaison, and a few operational aircraft relocated earlier to Romania or dispersed to fields in the southeast. The lack of sustained air combat reflected the prioritization of ground movement and the scarcity of targets whose destruction would decisively affect the timetable. Morale and perceptions shifted with each contact. For Soviet troops encountering negotiated disarmament, operations resembled large-scale policing with intermittent skirmishes. For units drawn into urban fighting, the risk profile increased, and commanders emphasized speed over complete encirclement to stay on schedule. For Polish soldiers and gendarmes, the presence of a second opponent altered calculations about conserving ammunition, guarding flanks, and protecting civilian convoys. Civilians assessed changes by immediate indicators, whether bakeries reopened, whether roads remained passable, and whether new authorities retained existing teachers, priests, and municipal staff, or replaced them with provisional committees. Unexpected outcomes arose from geography and timing. Delays at a single bridge could shift an entire column onto a slower route, exposing it to interception. Conversely, a destroyed culvert might halt a tank brigade long enough for defenders to disengage without a fight. The intersection of German advances from the west with Soviet thrusts from the east produced overlapping zones where Polish units had to negotiate passage with one opponent while avoiding the other, leading in some cases to disarmament under terms that allowed officers temporary freedom of movement and in others to detention and registration. By the close of September's third week, the pattern of first engagements was clear. Soviet fronts had secured most major towns east of the Bug and advanced to river lines and delimitation points agreed in August. Polish formations, under orders to avoid fruitless clashes, concentrated on reaching the southeast or neighbouring frontiers. The result was a series of short, localised battles and negotiated surrenders, punctuated by urban resistance where commanders identified crossings worth the time and cost to hold. These contacts set conditions for the next phase, in which operational consolidation, boundary formalisation, and the treatment of prisoners and civilians would take precedence over further rapid advance. Escalation proceeded along two tracks after September 20th. The consolidation of control over urban nodes and the widening of security operations behind the advancing fronts. In the north, columns moving through Lida, Baranowice, and Białystok deepened the occupation belt to the Narywbug line. In the south, pressure around Lwów and the Volhynian crossings increased as new Soviet echelons arrived from the interior. Reinforcements raised the combined strength of the Belarusian and Ukrainian fronts toward roughly 600,000 to 650,000 personnel by the last week of September, with 2,000 to 3,000 armoured vehicles of all types counted in reports, many requiring maintenance after long road marches. Opposing them in the east were dispersed Polish groupings, totaling perhaps 120,000 to 180,000 troops in transit or assembly, a number that declined daily as columns crossed into Romania and Hungary or were disarmed. Where Polish units retained cohesion, they could field battalion to regiment-sized elements. Most others moved as mixed detachments of infantry, police, and support services. The crisis for Polish command was organisational rather than tactical. With the government and commander-in-chief across the Romanian frontier, orders moved by courier from subordinate staffs, often arriving out of sequence as routes closed. Radio nets suffered from loss of power sources and the need for mobility. An instruction emphasising avoidance of unnecessary clashes remained in force, but local commanders had to interpret it against the immediate threat of encirclement, the presence of civilians inside their columns, and the uncertainty of treatment after disarmament. Some chose to negotiate the handover of weapons in towns where municipal services could continue. Others broke contact at dusk and pushed through secondary roads to reach river lines closer to the frontier. Terrain and weather now influenced tempo more than the first week had suggested. Autumn rains reduced road capacity in Polessie and Volhynia, causing tank brigades to concentrate on causeways and bridges, and to rely more on motorized infantry for clearing tasks. Engineering units on the Soviet side devoted significant time to bridge repair, ferry construction, and culvert reinforcement to prevent immobilization of columns. This focus on infrastructure created windows for Polish detachments to disengage from towns whose crossings were not immediately usable, or to redirect south along lesser-used tracks. The Sani fortified region, a line of pre-war bunkers and obstacles along parts of the Upper Horin, registered scattered engagements as garrisons attempted to delay movement. These held only until bypass routes were opened. Security operations expanded behind the front lines. NKVD groups established filtration points at rail stations, prisons, and administrative buildings to register officers, gendarmes, and state officials. Civilians were screened for weapons, radio sets, and documents. In some counties, local committees formed to manage food distribution and policing under supervision. In others, existing municipal staff remained in place while new oversight bodies compiled inventories of property and archives. For Polish soldiers laying down arms, outcomes varied. A portion were released home after registration. Larger numbers were directed to assembly camps pending decisions on status. Estimates for the second half of September and early October show several 100,000 Polish military personnel under some form of Soviet control, with the range reflecting different counting rules for active troops, reservists, and state services. International response moved at diplomatic speed, while events in the field advanced daily. London and Paris recorded formal protests and sought information from their embassies. Neither government adjusted military operations against Germany in the West in direct response to the Soviet entry. Bucharest admitted the Polish president and government ministers and interned military personnel who crossed the frontier, consistent with neutrality obligations. Over subsequent days, groups of Polish officers and specialists sought routes onward to France. Budapest applied policies that resulted in internment with later opportunities for transit. Regional practice depended on local commanders and diplomatic exchanges. Berlin and Moscow continued liaison contacts to avoid incidents along converging axes, while their diplomats prepared a boundary agreement to convert the provisional line into a formal demarcation. The escalation phase also produced concentrated urban episodes whose resolution affected surrounding districts. In Grodno, after the street fighting of September 20th to 22nd, Soviet units secured the city and established checkpoints on the approaches to prevent re-entry by Polish detachments seeking to cross the Niemen further downstream. In Lwów, negotiations concluded with the garrison's surrender to Soviet forces on September 22nd under terms that prioritize preservation of urban services and medical facilities. This decision altered the local dynamics for surrounding Polish units, which now faced Soviet positions on the eastern edge and German positions on the western and northern arcs. Traffic shifted toward crossings further south, increasing congestion on roads to Strij and Kołomija. As control zones expanded, shortages emerged on both sides, but with different effects. Soviet formations experienced wear on vehicles, especially BT series tanks, operating long distances on roads. Maintenance companies dealt with track and engine issues, while fuel supply relied on motor columns and captured stocks. Polish columns struggled with ammunition consumption from skirmishes and the need to feed civilians moving with them. Where bread ovens and mills could be kept working under new authorities, urban shortages eased. Where fighting disrupted power or transport, supply for both troops and civilians became problematic, prompting organized requisition by military administrations. The presence of multiple armed actors within small areas raised the risk of incidents. Liaison officers issued maps marking zones of responsibility. Yet armored reconnaissance units from different directions sometimes approached the same town. In places where German forces had first entered and later withdrew under coordination agreements, Polish prisoners captured earlier changed custody as the front lines shifted. These transfers added complexity to record keeping and to the expectations of captured personnel about their legal status. Both major powers prioritized avoidance of accidental clashes, but the density of movements near the bug crossings and around Brest required repeated clarification of routes and timing. Civilian institutions adapted unevenly. Schools in some towns reopened under provisional oversight with language policies pending. In others, administrators delayed decisions until a stable authority appeared. Religious institutions continued services with varied levels of interference. Land questions, central to expectations in rural districts, were deferred to future decrees, though proclamations signalled eventual redistribution. Urban employment centred on keeping rail yards, power stations, and hospitals functioning under supervision to prevent public order problems that could affect military traffic. By the last week of September, the political layer of escalation became explicit. Negotiations in Moscow led toward a boundary and friendship treaty that would formalise the division of administrative responsibility. In parallel, local plebiscites or assemblies were prepared for October to provide legal endorsement of changes in sovereignty in the occupied territories. For Polish authorities in exile, these developments reinforced the need to reconstruct state capacity abroad while preserving as many trained personnel as could be extracted through neutral states. Routes through Romania and the Black Sea acquired strategic significance for future Polish formations intended to regroup in France and later in other theatres. The crisis closed with a change in emphasis rather than a cessation of movement. The initiative in the East shifted from rapid advance to administration and boundary management. For Soviet commands, the metric of success became the number of districts with functioning councils, the volume of registered personnel, and the speed of rail conversion or transshipment. For Polish groupings still on the move, the measure was distance to the frontier and the integrity of units after crossing. The interaction of these goals defined the final days of September. A reduction in large firefights, a rise in negotiations and registrations, and the preparation of the legal instruments that would codify the new line pending further developments in the wider European war. By the fourth week of September, the campaign reached its highest tempo. Rapid thrusts ended at river lines and major towns, while command focus shifted to decisive nodes that would determine the shape of the new boundary. On 22nd September, in Brest-on-the-Bug, liaison officers from the German and Soviet commands coordinated a formal handover of the city and a march past to signal the transition of control along the provisional line. For field staffs, the event served a practical purpose. It synchronized traffic on roads converging from the west and east and reduced the risk of incidents between armored reconnaissance units entering and leaving the same urban space. South of Brest, checkpoints multiplied at bridges and rail yards as each side redistributed garrisons, according to maps exchanged in late August. Urban fighting peaked where crossings and depots could not be bypassed. In Grodno, contested on September 20th to 22nd, Soviet units secured the Niemen bridges and rail facilities only after clearing street barricades and rail embankments that fixed tanks in narrow approaches. Command reports emphasized time lost to obstacles and the need to bring up engineers and motorized infantry, while Polish local commanders recorded am man I ten I eshen, spent ankas walls, tied to holding bridgeheads long enough to cover withdrawals. In Lwow, surrounded from the west by German formations and from the east by Soviet spearheads, negotiations concluded on September 22nd with the surrender of the garrison to Soviet forces. The agreement reflected the garrison's assessment of urban damage risk and the desire to preserve municipal services, hospitals, and waterworks under a single authority. The transfer altered the situation of nearby Polish columns, which now had to detour towards Strydź and Kołomija to avoid encirclement. The most cohesive Polish field grouping in the Eastern Theatre assembled from KOP units and remnants of formations moving south under General Wilhelm Orlik Ruckermann. Between 21st September and 1st October, this column executed a sequence of engagements intended to reopen routes toward the Romanian and Hungarian frontiers. At Kotziauce on the 21st of September, near the Lithuanian border, Polish detachments fought to disengage from blocking forces and maintain east-west road access. On 28 September, near Sak, along the forest lake terrain of Polazy, concentrated Polish fire and counterattacks disrupted a Soviet motorized detachment and enabled a temporary passage south. On October 1st, at Wytyczno, after a night march, the same grouping attempted another breakout across marshy ground. Initial gains gave way to renewed pressure once artillery and fresh units arrived on the Soviet side, forcing a further withdrawal and fragmentation of the column. These actions, though tactically significant for the units involved, did not modify the overall balance created by numerical and mobility advantages in armour and motor transport. Force totals at the peak reflected cumulative reinforcement. The Belarusian and Ukrainian fronts together fielded on the order of 600,000 to 650,000 personnel by the last week of September, with several hundred T-26 and BT tanks concentrated on primary axes and additional armoured cars on secondary roads. Air support flew reconnaissance and limited strikes against road targets and depots, prioritising direction of ground echelons. Polish forces east of the Bug consisted mainly of marching columns, rear guards, and ad hoc battle groups, totalling roughly 120,000 to 180,000 personnel in movement, a number declining daily as units crossed into Romania and Hungary or were disarmed. Local superiority at chosen points allowed short counteractions, but the overall pattern favoured continued Soviet advance to designated lines and the division of remaining Polish groupings into smaller detachments. High command decisions converged with diplomatic timelines. On 28 September in Moscow, Germany and the USSR signed the Boundary and Friendship Treaty that converted the provisional line into a formal demarcation largely along the San, Bug, Narew, and Pisa. The treaty included protocols on the transfer of administration and on measures against activities by third parties. In the field, staffs implemented new instructions to halt forward elements at the agreed boundary, to complete disarmament and registration east of it, and to hand over certain localities already entered by German units. The result was a reallocation of checkpoints, patrol zones, and railguards to match the treaty map. Civilian conditions at the peak varied with access to supply and the speed of administrative substitution. In towns where power and water remained intact, bakeries and hospitals resumed operation quickly under supervision. Where fighting had damaged networks or where depots were emptied during withdrawals, rationing and requisition followed. Mixed populations, Polish, Jewish, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, experienced the transition through immediate practices, registration, currency controls, and reopening of schools with interim language and curriculum rules. Municipal staffs were kept in place in many districts for continuity, while provisional committees compiled inventories of property, archives, and industrial equipment. In several counties, the announcement of forthcoming assemblies prepared the ground for legal endorsement of administrative changes in October. The treatment of prisoners and disarmed personnel became a central operational issue. Registration points near railheads and prisons processed large numbers of soldiers, policemen, and officials. Officers were separated for further transfer, while many enlisted men were recorded and released or directed to assembly camps pending decisions on status. By early October, figures for Polish military personnel under Soviet control reached into the hundreds of thousands, with ranges reflecting whether reservists and state services were included. Transfers between German and Soviet custody occurred at several localities as boundary lines were adjusted and handovers finalized, adding complexity to lists and to expectations among detainees. Rear area security broadened as frontline pressure eased. NKVD units took over prisons, post and telegraph offices, and banks. Transport troops managed rail conversion, transshipment, and fuel depots. Engineering units repaired culverts and bridges damaged during earlier engagements to sustain supply for garrisons. Currency and taxation rules were introduced in stages to stabilize markets. Land policy remained under discussion, with proclamations signaling future redistribution, but leaving implementation to later decrees after administrative consolidation. External actors adjusted to the new situation. Romania interned military personnel and admitted political authorities who crossed the frontier, enabling formation of a Polish government in exile in France by the end of September and early October, with President Władysław Raczkiewicz and General Władysław Sikorski assuming key roles. Hungary interned soldiers and facilitated limited transit. Lithuania and Latvia interned units that crossed into their territories. Britain and France maintained war with Germany without opening hostilities against the USSR, while monitoring developments through diplomatic channels. By the first days of October, decisive engagements in the east had ended. The operational picture displayed completed occupation to the treaty line, concentration of Soviet garrisons in major towns and along rail corridors, and the reduction of organized Polish resistance in the Eastern Theatre to scattered detachments moving toward foreign frontiers. The campaign's peak thus closed, not with a single battle, but with the synchronization of military and diplomatic instruments, boundary formalization, prisoner processing, and the transition from maneuver to administration across the districts east of the Bug and San. Resistance and adaptation after the boundary settlement took multiple forms shaped by geography, law, and available resources. For Polish military personnel, the primary mode was organized withdrawal, regrouping abroad, and the creation of clandestine structures at home. Between late September and November 1939, military and police detachments crossed into Romania and Hungary in successive waves. Combined figures reached on the order of 80,000 personnel, including officers destined for reconstitution in France. Reception rules in Bucharest and Budapest required internment, but coordination by Polish liaison officers, with consent from host authorities, enabled controlled departures by rail and sea. By December, cadres assembled at camps in France began to form new units under General Władysław Sikorski, with the Air Force rebuilding from crews who had previously flown to Romania or Latvia and then onward. Inside occupied Poland, the framework for underground command emerged before large-scale arrests reduced overt activity. On 27 September 1939 in besieged Warsaw, officers initiated Służba Zwycięstwu Polski, a coordination nucleus later reorganized into Związek Walki Zbrojnej across territories under German and Soviet control. Its functions were modular: communications, intelligence, courier networks, and weapons caching. Couriers used railway worker contacts, postal routes, and rural tracks to move reports and personnel across the new boundary. Printing presses reassembled in cellars produced bulletins that standardized orders, warned against uncontrolled actions, and directed scarce resources toward reconnaissance rather than open clashes that would consume ammunition without strategic gain. In the Eastern Territories under Soviet administration, adaptation followed the sequence of proclamation, registration, and institutional substitution. October assemblies endorsed incorporation into the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet republics. Schools reopened with revised curricula, and languages of instruction matched to local policies. currency controls replaced zloty with ruble at set conversion rates. Land measures began with inventories and transfers of large estates and church land to committees, with detailed redistributions scheduled for later decrees. NKVD organs extended filtration beyond officers and policemen to include officials, landowners, and selected professionals. Networks used by Polish underground organizers adjusted accordingly. New cells shifted meetings to market days to blend into traffic, avoided predictable routes, and diversified caches between urban attics and rural barns to reduce risk from concentrated searches. Local populations adjusted along their own timelines. In the eastern voivodeships, mixed communities of Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Jews, and Lithuanians responded to changing authority by prioritizing immediate needs, keeping bakeries running, securing fuel for winter, keeping schools and synagogues or churches open. Municipal clerks in many towns remained in office to maintain registries and ration cards, while responding to directives from newly appointed councils. Some residents accepted positions in provisional bodies to stabilize services. Others withdrew from public roles to avoid scrutiny under new political criteria. Movement patterns reflected the boundary. Individuals who feared arrests in one zone sought passage to the other. Families divided to retain property or employment in place, while younger members attempted to leave. German-Soviet coordination on boundary management influenced resistance options. Liaison commissions exchanged lists and arranged transfers of prisoners and civilians whose residence or employment lay across the demarcation line, while railway administrations synchronized timetables to minimize congestion at bridges and yards. For Polish clandestine structures, this stabilized certain transit points, but increased surveillance, prompting the creation of alternative corridors through forest strips and minor stations. Intelligence reports prioritized counting garrisons, mapping depots, and estimating the speed of rail conversion, with emphasis on data usable by exiled commands planning future operations. Armed resistance in the east during late 1939 remained limited and episodic. After the withdrawals and the engagements at Kodzioce, Sak, and Wytyczno, remnants of cohesive formations dissolved into small groups whose primary aim was evasion. The calculus was logistical. Without steady supply, sustained guerrilla activity risked rapid attrition and civilian reprisals that would disrupt the networks needed for information flow. Where opportunities arose, cells focused on recovering hidden weapons, establishing safe houses, and training couriers in signal plans and codes. In the German zone, clandestine organizations developed faster due to the density of urban populations and existing political networks. In the Soviet zone, early priorities of the underground centered on documentation, identity management, and the preservation of cadres until conditions changed. Soviet administrative adaptation addressed mobility and control. Railways underwent phased conversion and transshipment schemes to move units, grain, and coal. Security forces layered checkpoints along major roads and rail nodes while granting passes for essential workers to prevent production shortfalls. Conscription and labor assignments were prepared for subsequent cycles after incorporation, with registers built from census-like surveys. These practices affected the options of underground organizers. A worker assigned to a depot could gather rail data but faced travel restrictions. A teacher could track changes in curricula and youth organizations, but risked dismissal upon suspicion of non-compliance. The underground's response was to distribute tasks across multiple individuals to limit the impact of arrests. Psychological adaptation appeared in routine. Soldiers in internment camps in Romania and Hungary established training schedules, language classes, and technical courses to preserve skills for later deployment. In towns under new administration, civilians measured stability by whether trams ran, flour arrived, and winter fuel allocations were honoured. Underground commanders measured morale by courier punctuality and the survival of cells after minor arrests. In both zones, rumours, about Allied offensives in the West, about boundary revisions, about amnesty offers, required constant verification. Clandestine bulletins devoted space to correcting misinformation that could trigger premature actions. Resource management shaped every choice. Ammunition captured or retained from September had to be preserved. Radios required secure power sources. False papers needed consistent seals and typefaces. Underground treasuries allocated funds to couriers and printers while avoiding large caches that could be seized. In exile, procurement lists compiled in October specified small arms, uniforms, radio sets, and aircraft types to be requested from French stocks for new Polish units. Naval personnel who had escaped to Britain coordinated with Royal Navy officers to place experienced crews on Allied ships while awaiting the reformation of national flotillas. Adaptation also meant legal continuity. The Polish government in exile appointed representatives for occupied districts and established instructions for reporting chains that recognized the realities of split zones. Orders emphasized neutral language in documents to reduce the risk of political accusations during searches. For communities in the East, changes in citizenship status were announced with procedures for registration. Individuals weighed applications against the implications for future mobility and property rights, often delaying decisions until more information emerged. By late autumn, resistance was a structure of preparation rather than combat. Abroad, personnel concentrated, trained, and planned beneath Allied umbrellas. At home, networks learned the new administrative rhythms, mapped risk, and preserved human capital. Opposing authorities achieved their own forms of adaptation. Stable garrisons, functioning rail and municipal services, and layered security. The resulting equilibrium was not static. It was a pause in which each side conserved strength, gathered information, and adjusted to a boundary that had transformed roots, institutions, and expectations within a matter of weeks. The decisive change came through law and boundary rather than a single battle. On 28 September 1939 in Moscow, Germany and the USSR signed the Boundary and Friendship Treaty that converted the provisional line into a formal demarcation largely along the San, Bug, Nauru and Pisa. Annex protocols regulated transfers of administration, exchanges of prisoners captured in zones now assigned to the other party, and coordination against activities by third actors. For field commands, this ended forward movement and redirected effort to garrisons, registration and rail conversion. For Polish units still in the east, it signalled that attempts to reopen routes would now confront fixed checkpoints and a closing boundary rather than fluid columns. Military timelines aligned around the same week. In the west, the Polish campaign ended with the capitulation of the independent operational group Policji at Kock on the 6th of October, after engagements from the 2nd to the 5th of October. In the east, organised Polish groupings had already fragmented under dual pressure and were reduced by early October to detachments crossing into Romania, Hungary, Lithuania, or Latvia. Soviet forces in the occupied zone now numbered on the order of 600,000 to 650,000 personnel, with several hundred T-26 and BT tanks distributed among fronts and armies. Polish personnel remaining in movement east of the Bug numbered roughly in the tens of thousands and declined daily as crossings or disarmament proceeded. The balance changed from manoeuvre to administration. The legal layer advanced quickly after the treaty. In October 1939, people's assemblies were organised in the occupied territories to endorse incorporation into the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet republics. The Supreme Soviet then passed acts on November 1st to 2nd formalising the inclusion, which triggered extensions of Soviet criminal, civil and fiscal codes, currency conversion from zloty to ruble at fixed rates, and the reorganisation of courts and police. In parallel, on October 10th, the USSR and Lithuania concluded a mutual assistance treaty. Wilno and surrounding districts, taken by Soviet troops in September, were transferred to Lithuania, and Soviet garrisons received basing rights on Lithuanian territory. These steps redefined the regional map without further large-scale fighting. For prisoners and disarmed personnel, the turning point was procedural. Registration that had begun in late September led to separation by category. Officers and selected state officials were directed to special camps such as Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. Gendarmes and police were concentrated elsewhere. Large numbers of enlisted men and reservists were recorded and released or sent to labor formations pending decisions on status. Estimates for Polish military personnel under Soviet control by October range from roughly 200,000 to above 300,000 when including reservists and auxiliary services. Officer cohorts numbered in the tens of thousands. Transfers with Germany occurred at boundary points where persons captured earlier in the month changed custody according to residence or employment lists. These measures fixed the fate of many individuals who had previously expected continued movement toward foreign frontiers. Polish state continuity moved abroad. On the 30th of September, Władysław Raczkiewicz assumed the presidency and General Władysław Sikorski became Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief. Allied governments recognized the new authorities as the legal continuation of the Polish state. By October-November, cadres reaching France through Romania and other routes began forming units under French command arrangements, while naval personnel already in Britain or at sea integrated with Allied flotillas. The Air Force, drawing on crews that had flown out in September, reassembled for training and reassignment. This transfer of command, centers from occupied territory to exile, converted defeat on the ground into a long war strategy based on foreign theatres. For civilians, the treaty weak-fixed horizons. Boundary posts, rail patrols, and document checks stabilised. Temporary crossings used in late September closed or were licensed through limited channels. Municipal practices shifted from emergency maintenance to routine under new rules. Ration cards, tax collection, school curricula, and registry books followed Soviet templates after incorporation. Land policy moved from proclamations to administrative action. Inventories of estates and church properties, creation of committees for redistribution, and preparation of cadastral changes. Population movements followed several legal paths. Between late 1939 and 1940, agreements between Germany and the USSR enabled transfers of selected groups across the demarcation, including persons categorized by nationality or employment, with numbers in the tens of thousands. Separate flows involved refugees returning to family homes now located across the line. Each movement required lists, certificates, and rail capacity that were now under centralized control. International reactions reflected the new situation. Britain and France, already at war with Germany, did not extend hostilities to the USSR. Diplomatic notes protested the invasion and subsequent incorporation, but military planning in the West remained focused on Germany. The League of Nations lacked instruments to reverse events. Neutral states bordering the region applied internment law while enabling controlled onward travel by agreement. Romania, Hungary, and Lithuania continued to process Polish soldiers and civilians through camps and permits under varying conditions. Information control consolidated the turning point. Underground networks that had formed during September adapted to stable garrisons rather than moving columns. Courier routes now avoided major bridges and stations, shifting to minor stops and forest strips. Intelligence priorities changed from counting advancing echelons to mapping depots, prisons, and administrative offices. In the Soviet zone, the extension of registration, identity papers, and work assignments narrowed opportunities for clandestine travel. In the German zone, the creation of general government institutions in October produced different constraints and openings. The presence of two administrations with distinct legal systems required the Polish underground to build parallel procedures for documents, finance, and liaison. Regionally, the October arrangements altered calculations beyond Poland. Lithuania received Wilno, but accepted Soviet garrisons under the Mutual Assistance Treaty, a signal of wider security changes in the Baltic. Latvia and Estonia concluded similar agreements with Soviet basing rights in September-October, while Finland resisted demands, leading to a separate conflict in late November. These developments created a strategic arc from the Baltic to the Black Sea, within which the September boundary in Poland was one component of a larger shift. Thus, the turning point consisted of synchronized decisions rather than a single engagement. A boundary treaty on September 28th that halted maneuver, incorporation acts on the 1st to 2nd of November that extended laws and institutions, and administrative routines that replaced fluid front lines with fixed procedures. For the Soviet side, success measures became districts administered, rail kilometers converted or transshipped, and numbers registered. For the Polish side, continuity shifted to exile commands and underground cadres aligned to new legal realities. For civilians, daily life reoriented to offices, schools, and ration cards under new authorities. The initiative now moved from open fields to ministries, camps, and rail yards, defining the conditions under which subsequent events in 1940 would unfold. Combat operations in the East ended not through a single capitulation, but through the accumulation of withdrawals, disarmament, and boundary enforcement. After early October 1939, remaining Polish detachments moved toward foreign frontiers in small groups, often without heavy weapons. Crossing points into Romania and Hungary stayed active into November as columns arrived in dispersed streams rather than organized formations. Estimates for personnel who reached Romania and Hungary combined range between roughly 70,000 and 100,000, with additional groups of several tens of thousands entering Lithuania and Latvia, where internment followed local rules. These movements extracted trained cadres for later use abroad, while reducing the number of armed men inside the occupied zone. For units that did not cross borders, the end state was registration and detention. By October, the number of Polish military personnel under Soviet control reached several 100,000 when counting active troops, reservists, police, and state services. Officer cohorts numbered in the tens of thousands and were separated into special camps. Transfers with Germany at boundary points reassigned persons captured earlier according to residence or employment, and in the opposite direction moved selected categories from the Soviet zone. Lists, rail capacity, and custody rules now governed outcomes more than tactical movement had done in September. Occupation routines stabilized along rail and river lines. Soviet garrisons concentrated in administrative centers and at junctions, while frontier troops and NKVD units layered checkpoints along the new demarcation. Rail conversion proceeded by sectors, with transshipment used where regauging was not yet complete. Municipal services restarted under supervision. Power stations, waterworks, and hospitals received priority for fuel and staff. Currency and price regulations followed the incorporation measures of November, replacing zloty with ruble at set rates. Food supply depended on local harvests and requisition plans. Where depots had been depleted during September, rationing followed until stocks recovered. Polish state structures transitioned to exile. The government formed in France appointed representatives for occupied districts and set reporting chains through couriers and radio. Military cadres from Romania embarked by sea from Constanta to Mediterranean ports and onward to French camps, where formations took shape under Allied arrangements. Naval personnel already at sea or in British ports entered Allied service. Air crews assembled for retraining and reassignment. Diplomatic missions in neutral capitals coordinated documentation and finance for these movements, while legal acts confirmed continuity of the state beyond its occupied territory. Civilian outcomes diverged by zone and by community. In the East, October assemblies and subsequent legal acts extended Soviet administrative norms. Schools reopened with revised curricula and language policies. Courts and police reorganized. Land measures moved from inventories to transfers of large estates and church properties to committees pending redistribution. Registration campaigns recorded residence by profession and origin, establishing the basis for future conscription and labor assignments. In towns, employment concentrated on rail, power, and food distribution. In rural districts, autumn tasks proceeded under supervision with requisition quotas. In the West, the German occupation created the general government in October. Different legal frameworks on either side of the boundary produced distinct rules on movement, property, and employment that households had to navigate when family members or assets lay across the line. Population movements continued after the fighting ended. Refugees who had fled east in September sought to regularize status under the new authorities, while some attempted to return to homes now west of the boundary through licensed exchanges. Agreements between Germany and the USSR enabled transfers of selected categories in late 1939 and 1940, numbering in the tens of thousands. Separate flows involved professionals called back to workplaces, families reuniting, or individuals relocating for employment. Each movement required documents, medical checks, and rail bookings that were now centrally controlled. Parallel to these legal channels, clandestine routes persisted for couriers and for persons avoiding registration. Public order reflected the new equilibrium. Patrols enforced curfews and document checks. Markets reopened under regulated prices. Municipal committees balanced ration cards against available stocks. Religious institutions continued services under varying degrees of oversight. The administrative emphasis on continuity reduced the likelihood of unrest that could disrupt rail traffic, yet it also increased record-keeping that constrained mobility for individuals of interest to the authorities. Newspapers and proclamations framed the preceding month as completed and directed attention to winter preparation, schooling, and work assignments. For Polish soldiers and officials in custody, the near term consisted of camp routines, interrogations, and reclassification. Enlisted men were frequently released or assigned to labor units after registration. Officers, police, and selected officials were concentrated in separate locations pending decisions not disclosed to the detainees. Communications from camps to families moved through censored channels or not at all, creating uncertainty about the status of those detained. Exchanges at boundary points occasionally altered custody, but most detainees remained within the Soviet system as administrative consolidation advanced. International responses adjusted to accomplish facts. Britain and France recognized the Polish government in exile and integrated its forces into Allied structures, but they did not confront the USSR militarily. Neutral states continued to apply internment law while permitting controlled onward travel by agreement. The League of Nations did not change the situation on the ground. German-Soviet liaison commissions continued to manage the practical aspects of the boundary, including railway timetables, postal routes, and the handling of cases where jurisdiction was disputed. Local economies reoriented to new markets and regulations. Workshops shifted production to meet garrison and infrastructure needs. State monopolies took over sectors such as tobacco and alcohol distribution. Taxation and fee schedules were introduced to match Soviet practice in newly incorporated territories. Price changes and currency conversion affected savings held in zloty, with compensation or exchange rates set by decree rather than negotiation. For households, the immediate measure of stability was access to bread, fuel, and employment rather than the larger diplomatic frame in which these changes had occurred. The withdrawal phase for Polish armed elements concluded as the last organized groups crossed borders or were disarmed by early October. Thereafter, the principal activity for the Polish side inside the country shifted to clandestine organization and information gathering. While outside the country, it shifted to training, procurement, and planning under Allied supervision. For the Soviet side, the emphasis moved to administration, registration, and the integration of transport and legal systems. The humanitarian dimension consisted of rationing, housing adjustments for displaced families, and the management of camps and prisons. The battlefield had disappeared from the map, but its consequences were embedded in institutions that would shape daily life through the winter of 1939 to 1940 and define the context for later events. The legacy of the September 1939 Eastern Campaign unfolded in law, borders, institutions, and memory, more than in later battlefield narratives. The Boundary and Friendship Treaty of 28 September fixed a demarcation that became the administrative frame for incorporation acts on 1st to 2nd November 1939. In practical terms, roughly 200,000 square kilometers of pre-war Poland, with a population on the order of 13 to 14 million, were transferred into the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet republics, with Wilno and surrounding districts assigned to Lithuania on 10 October and later incorporated into the USSR when Lithuania's status changed in 1940. These measures altered the distribution of languages, schools, courts, and property law across districts that had been administered from Warsaw for nearly 2 decades. For the Polish state, continuity shifted abroad. The government formed in France and later relocated to Britain maintained diplomatic recognition from Allied powers and commanded Polish armed forces that re-formed outside the country. The Polish Navy and Air Force contributed to Allied operations from 1939 onward. Ground units assembled in France in 1939 to 1940, and in the Middle East after the July 1941 Sikorsky-Maisky Agreement, which restored Polish-Soviet relations following Germany's attack on the USSR on 22 June 1941. Between March and August 1942, approximately 115,000 people, including about 78,000 soldiers and 37,000 civilians, evacuated from the USSR to Iran, enabling the creation of the Polish Second Corps that later fought in Italy. These figures demonstrate how personnel removed from the September campaign's end state re-entered the war through different theatres. For the Soviet side, the annexed territories provided strategic depth and resources, but also exposed new front lines when Germany broke the Non-Aggression Pact. In June-July 1941, initial encirclements at Białystok-Minsk and later at Uman and near Smolensk took place on or beyond the 1939 boundary, indicating that gains in territory translated into longer defensive lines and more infrastructure to protect. Rail regauging and administrative integration completed in 1940 enabled mobilization, but could not offset surprise and the concentration of German armoured groups along chosen axes. The territories incorporated from Poland thus became both staging areas and early battlegrounds of the 1941 campaign. Civilian trajectories diverged under the new administration and later under occupation changes after 1941. Between 1939 and mid-1941, registration, land transfers, and labour assignments reshaped economic life in the annexed districts. Deportations from these areas occurred in several waves, with estimates ranging into the hundreds of thousands, when including families categorised by profession, origin, or prior state service. Numbers vary by method and time frame, and historians use different baselines and document sets, but the direction of movement and the administrative mechanisms are clear from surviving orders and transport records. After June 1941, German occupation brought a different legal and security regime, during which the Jewish population of the region suffered destruction through ghettos and mass shootings. The sequence, Soviet incorporation, German occupation, and later the return of Soviet administration, produced layered changes in property, registry status, and demographic composition that shaped post-war claims and policies. The treatment of prisoners captured in 1939 formed a separate line of legacy. officers and selected officials held in special camps were executed in spring 1940 at sites including the Katyn Forest near Smolensk, as well as Kalinin, Tver, and Kharkiv. Responsibility, attributed to the NKVD in documents released or acknowledged beginning in 1990, entered official statements in the USSR and later in the Russian Federation and Poland at different times, with legal characterizations varying by jurisdiction. The existence of these executions affected Polish-Soviet relations during the war, contributed to the breakdown of diplomatic ties in April 1943, and remains a point of commemoration and historical investigation. Borders set or implied in 1939 influenced post-war settlements. At Yalta and Potsdam in 1945, the Allies accepted a Polish eastern frontier close to the so-called Curzon Line, with adjustments near Białystok and Przemysl, while Poland received territories to the west and north up to the Oder-Neisse. Population exchanges and post-war resettlements followed, moving millions across new state lines between 1944 and 1947. The Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet republics gained the districts incorporated in 1939, and these boundaries later contributed to the international borders recognized after 1991, when Belarus and Ukraine became independent states. Bilateral treaties in the 1990s confirmed frontiers between Poland and its eastern neighbors, converting wartime demarcations into peacetime borders. Institutional memory developed along national lines. In Poland, commemorations mark both the German invasion of 1st September and the Soviet entry of 17th September, with museums and archives presenting administrative records, orders, and personal testimonies. In Belarus and Ukraine, the narrative often emphasizes the incorporation of Western Belarus and Western Ukraine and the social policies introduced in 1939 to 1940, alongside accounts of arrests, deportations, and wartime losses. In Russia, state and academic publications discuss the Non-Aggression Pact in the context of interwar diplomacy, the secret protocol as a condemned instrument after the 24th of December 1989, and the strategic environment before June 1941. Internationally, the 23rd of August is observed in Europe as a day of remembrance for victims of totalitarian regimes, linking the 1939 German-Soviet agreements to wider discussions of 20th century violence and law. Historiography reflects these frameworks. Researchers compare orders of battle, casualty lists, and transport manifests to reconstruct the September 1939 Eastern Campaign's scale and tempo. Debates focus on the legal status of the Soviet entry under international law of the time, the wording of notes delivered on September 17th, the degree of Polish command continuity as the government crossed into Romania, and the comparative experience of civilians under different administrations. Quantitative work examines troop ratios, Soviet fronts with roughly 450,000 to 650,000 personnel against dispersed Polish groupings in the east that declined from about 250,000 to below 200,000 during the second half of September, while logistical studies analyse how rail gauge differences, bridge availability, and depot locations shaped outcomes more than sustained fighting did. The campaign's significance lies in how it reconfigured the war's geography and the political map of East-Central Europe. It ended the interwar Polish state within its 1921 borders, created a two-power occupation space divided by a negotiated line, and set conditions for the later wartime alliance and rupture between the Polish government in exile and the USSR. It provided the Soviet Union with forward positions that became the first echelon of the 1941 defense, and supplied Germany with a secure rear area for operations against France and later against the USSR until the alliance broke. For local societies, it defined who held registries, schools, and land offices from autumn 1939 onward, and thus who could authorize movement, employment, and property claims. Commemoration and legal acts since 1989 have addressed components of this legacy without producing a single transnational narrative. Documents have been published, sites marked, and bilateral commissions convened. The period's figures and dates: 1st September, 17th September, 28th September, 1st to 2nd November. Anchor discussions that continue to assess intentions, decisions, and outcomes using comparable standards across all sides. In this sense, the 1939 Eastern Campaign remains a case where military movement lasted weeks, but its consequences measured in borders, institutions, and memories extend across decades.